Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash. Hello, everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Mike and Molly. This episode, we are going to kind of neatly wrap up our discussion of aerobic metabolism with a discussion of the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation, which is pretty fun. We've been in this unit for how many? 3 episodes?
3. I think this is our third episode, really, in the aerobic metabolism kind of pathway. First, we talked about glycolysis, then we talked PDC and TCA. And if you're like, what are you guys talking about? Go watch those episodes, and they lead in really well to this crescendo of aerobic metabolism that we're going to talk about today, which is the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. But what's great, right, is it's not just this, the stuff that we're going to talk about, especially today, isn't just related to the last 2 episodes, but also we're going to be bringing a whole bunch of ideas back from our redox episode, from thermodynamics. So we're going to be bringing all of these ideas back. So this is why, again, when Molly, you and I, when we did this, how long ago was it when we kind of made this sort of plan where it was like a while ago, a couple months ago, we were like, we need to cover, redox and thermodynamics in order to build up to really understand the pathways like the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. And so for anyone listening, if you don't have a firm understanding of redox reactions and thermodynamics, we're going to be discussing it today, but highly recommend going back and listening to those episodes so that you can kind of see where we're coming from when we explain these things. And again, I can promise you will not regret it. Like the way that, again, Molly and I explain these things, because our goal is so that you understand. We do not aim to memorize. We're always about intentionally learning these things so that you can actually answer questions about them. And so, in summation, super excited. We built up to this for a long time.
Yes. So let's do a little super quick crash course, like an outline of the things that we've talked about already, the things that we think are going to be involved here, right? Of course, this is, as we said, this is our third of 3 episodes on aerobic respiration. This is how the body metabolizes glucose all the way into carbon dioxide and water, right? And of course, in the process, we're making ATP. That's the point. That's why you eat things like an apple or a potato that's very starchy, or a granola bar. That's why we consume food, is to get energy from it. However, the food that we eat is very large. We need to break it down into smaller components. That is what aerobic metabolism is. We also talked about anaerobic metabolism, right, where you get a lot less bang for your buck. The key difference is aerobic, you have oxygen, anaerobic, you don't, right? So these pathways that we've talked about in last episode, right, with the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex and the TCA cycle, that will follow glycolysis, the first step, as well as the steps today, the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. These are all things that will only happen if you have oxygen. If you don't, you're doing glycolysis and you're using fermentation to recreate your starting materials, and you just do glycolysis, basically, to make energy. We talked about all of this over the past 2 episodes, but again, we will also be touching on redox. What's most important from that episode is an understanding of what a reduction potential is. Basically, it's a numerical value that describes how much you want to be reduced compared to hydrogen. So if you're +2 as a reduction potential, it means you want it more than hydrogen, since you're positive. And it's a relative value of 2. Right? It doesn't mean that you will always be reduced. It doesn't mean you'll always be oxidized. But we can talk about how much different atoms or molecules want to be reduced relative to each other. And of course, when something that wants to be reduced is reduced, and something that doesn't want to be reduced, which of course means to gain an electron, Leo goes grr. The other thing is oxidized. That is spontaneous. So we'll also be talking a little bit about thermodynamics here. Spontaneous reactions release energy because they are favorable, right? The products have lower energy than the reactants. That energy can be used to do stuff. So this whole path of ETC is very literally a path where we have molecules, right, donating electrons through reduction to molecules that want electrons more. And therefore, that's a spontaneous reaction that gives off energy, which then can be stored indirectly as ATP. We'll talk about what the linking step is
like
between
what goes between them,
and ATP synthesis, because it's not direct. But that's kind of the story in case you're listening to this podcast for the very first time, in which case, welcome, by the way.
Hey, what's up?
Lovely to meet you. Happy you're here. That's a little recap as far as the things that we've talked about so far that are relevant. And I feel like now we're pretty much ready to get into electron transport chain specifically. Did I leave anything out?
I think you hit on like the big things, redox and thermodynamics are like the really two things. And again, we're gonna like some terms we're gonna bring up today that will definitely refer to those things. Will definitely come up. But like we were saying before, while we just gave like a quick summary now, if you're not solid with these concepts, go watch those episodes. Just go back and watch them and then just pause it now and go back and then just come back here after. But yeah, let's kind of start with kind of like setting the stage with the mitochondria, like of the electron transport chain, about where it occurs. And I think this is kind of an important part, always knowing about the compartmentalization, or rather where these processes occur. Because when we talked about kind of in our last two episodes, glycolysis in the cytoplasm, very old pathway, doesn't need the mitochondria. Then we talked about the pyruvate dehydrogenase complex, TCA cycle. We now entered into the mitochondrial matrix, kind of that inner space in the mitochondria. And now that we've moved on to the electron transport chain, we are still in the mitochondria. It's not somewhere else, it's within the mitochondria, but it's in a little bit of a different place in the PDC and the TCA cycle, because the PDC and TCA cycle were in the matrix of the mitochondria, that kind of inner space of the mitochondria. Again, I want to be very careful how I say that word. Like the most central space in the mitochondria is the matrix.
In case anyone doesn't know, mitochondria have two membranes.
Right.
So this is inside not just the first membrane, but the second. So it's all the way in the middle. Right. It's like a little hot dog with the squiggly line. The matrix is the inside of the mustard of the hot dog.
Oh, wild. I have never thought of the mitochondria as a hot dog, but hey.
It looks so much like a hot dog. Are you serious?
I always kind of think about like a potato, you know, like when you like a baked potato with like the top, you know, the kind of top, you know,
that works.
You know what but I can see a hot dog with the mustard.
My American is showing.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I don't know if potatoes are very Canadian, but we'll just say they are. But yeah, so absolutely, thank you for that. Like where we have in the mitochondria, we have the outer mitochondrial membrane, then an inner mitochondrial membrane. The space between that space, which is actually going to be very important for the electron transport chain, is the intermembrane space. Makes sense, it's between the two membranes space. And then within the second membrane is the matrix. So you have outer membrane, intramembrane space, the second membrane, which is the inner membrane, and then you have the matrix. So the PDC and the TCA, the two cycles that we talked about last episode, if you haven't watched it, go back and watch it, happened in the matrix. But the electron transport chain happens on the inner mitochondrial membrane. So not the outer, it happens within the membrane. So all the proteins that are associated with the electron transport chain are membrane bound proteins. They are within that membrane, the inner mitochondrial membrane, not the outer one, the inner one, that second inner one. And this idea is very important because of the ideas and really the goal of the electron transport chain. Because when I ask a lot of students, like, what is the goal of the electron transport chain specifically? Specifically the electron transport chain.
Oh, it makes ATP.
Absolutely not. Wrong. Absolutely not. And they're like, what are you talking about?
What are you talking about?
I've always learned in like high school and university, the electron transport chain generates ATP. It does not generate a single, like indirectly, but not really, because there's kind of two pathways involved. The goal of the electron transport chain is not to generate ATP. The goal of the electron transport chain is simply to create a chemical gradient, right, which stores energy. That is the goal of the electron transport chain, and only the goal. The chemical gradient that we're talking about is a proton gradient. That is the chemical that we're talking about. I mean, when we talked about it with acids and bases way back. But we want to create a gradient where we have a little bit of protons in the matrix and a lot of protons in that intermembrane space. Again, now we're kind of referring back to it. And the goal of the electron transport chain is to create that gradient. But when we think about creating a gradient, I want to take things that are in a low concentration and bring them to a high concentration. When I kind of think about like the ideas of like entropy, for example, does that sound very favorable to do something like that?
No, entropy is randomness or disorder or freedom, as I like to think of it.
Mm-hmm.
And we're kind of locking them away in a very small room and just shoving more and more and more protons in there.
Right.
That doesn't sound very favorable.
Very not favorable. Extremely not. Yeah, we are actually organizing it more. I'm always the chaos organizing mindset. In my mind, we're
With
organizing
your
it more.
socks, I
With my
remember.
socks. Like, again, if you don't know what we're talking about, go watch the episode.
Yeah.
I always think about entropy as my socks in my room. But anyway.
Yeah.
Anyway, if you know, you know. But yeah, you're essentially like really putting everything back in drawers or something. Very organized. The universe, though, hates organization. It wants spread out. It wants freedom. So if my goal is to organize these protons, create that gradient, that's not favorable. But if I want something not favorable still to occur, like, how does that happen, Molly? Like, how can I make something that's not favorable? The universe does not want it to happen. How can that thing still happen?
Well, you need an input of energy. And like we were just talking about with redox potentials, if we have electrons flowing to atoms or molecules that want more and more to be reduced, that is going to release energy. So that's what's going to power our proton pumping.
Right. And this idea of pairing something that's favorable to something that's unfavorable is the idea of, say it with me, Molly, coupling. Darn it, we did not time that.
Good. That was good.
It was
No,
really
I
off
thought it
on
was
my end.
perfect.
Oh, maybe because on my end it sounded like, oh, interesting. Maybe because of the delay. Anyway, coupling coupling is the idea that we're talking about here. A lot of the like all the electron transport chain really is just coupling something favorable to something unfavorable. So when we think about the electron transport chain, the goal is coupling these redox reactions that are very favorable to this unfavorable process of pumping protons across the gradient. So that's kind of like the big overview. That's the goal, is to harness these redox reactions and to create a proton gradient. But now let's kind of zoom in on the electron transport chain to walk through the process. And I know, Molly, you love this part.
I do. I really do. I love the ETC. It gets me going, right? I told you guys last episode, this is one of my favorite things to talk about, because it's such a beautiful combination of everything that we've talked about. And really, to be honest with you, one of my favorite things, I teach our live courses a lot, and there's a lesson, especially in the intensive course that we teach, that's like a MCAT boot camp, basically. There's a lesson where in 3 hours I teach redox, electrochemistry, and the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. We've already covered a lot of the meat there, so to speak. Like, we've covered a lot of the really important background material to discuss ETC. So this is just going to be combining what we know, right? Basically, like we said, the ETC, we're going to have a couple main protein complexes, complex 1, 2, 3, and 4. And we also have a couple mobile electron carriers that will help us shuttle electrons from one complex to the next. I want to be super, super intentional here, because it really sounds like electrons go from 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. That is not how this works, okay? You're going to see that we have 2 mobile electron carriers, not 3, right? We don't go from 1 to 2. We go from 1 to 3 and from 2 to 3. There are 2 different entry points to the electron transport chain, right? 1 and 2 accept electrons from different molecules. And I love the naming scheme here, because complex 1 accepts electrons from NADH, which was one of our reduced electron carriers that we produced in all over aerobic respiration, right? Those were storing energy, high energy electrons. NADH has 1 hydrogen, right? Has 1 hydrogen, NADH, and goes to complex 1. Complex 2 accepts electrons from FADH2, right? NADH with 1 hydrogen, complex 1, FADH2 to complex 2. These are 2 different complexes that will accept electrons from our 2 different reduced electron carriers. Okay, both of these will drop off their electrons to coenzyme Q. You might hear ubiquinone to ubiquinol. That's when we are accepting electrons versus when we're holding on to them and dropping them off at the next stop, which is complex 3. Complex 3 is going to accept those electrons and then pass them over through cytochrome C, another mobile electron carrier, then to complex 4. All the while, right, with almost every complex, we're pumping protons. And it's because NADH and FADH2 have pretty low reduction potentials. They really
Relatively, yeah.
Yeah, they don't really want the electrons that they have. And so when they interact with these complexes, the complexes want the electrons much more. They have a higher reduction potential. That transfer is therefore spontaneous, right? And flowing all throughout the complex is spontaneous. If that release of energy is sufficient to pump protons, it will. Really, it's complex 2 that doesn't. Complex 2 does not pump protons. Everything else will. 1, 3, and 4, which means we are building that gradient. And then ultimately, just those electrons end up on oxygen. That's why we breathe oxygen, right? And we make water, and that's it. That we're done with glucose reduction or glucose oxidation. We're done with that overall reaction. We haven't made ATP yet, but that really is the ETC, the broad overview that we might need.
Right.
So, I mean, that's pretty much
that's kind of like the things to know, right? And I love that you were like, oh yeah, some things kind of are kind of giving their electrons to another thing. Wait a minute. And I was thinking all the way through, like, wait, something's losing an electron, then nothing's gaining an electron. Oh wait, isn't that just a whole bunch of redox reactions? And it is. Like the electron transport chain is just a whole bunch of redox reactions. And like we were saying, and I think you put wonderfully, these redox reactions, because they're spontaneous, negative delta G, that means the products are more stable than the reactants, and therefore there's a release of energy. And that energy is what we use to pump the protons. And kind of reiterating what you mentioned, 1, 3, and 4 all have those redox reactions enough to pump protons. So when the electrons are gained there by those complexes, right, they take that energy like, wonderful, let me put protons. But complex 2, right, complex 2, there's not enough energy from that redox reaction to actually pump protons, along with the fact that like complex 2 doesn't even span the whole membrane. Like if you actually looked at a picture of the electron transport chain, 1, 3, and 4, those proteins are transmembrane. They transfer the whole membrane, whereas complex 2 is only like on like half the membrane, only on the bottom leaflet, like that bottom half of the membrane. So it doesn't even transfer the whole membrane to pump protons. So there's no protons pumped there whatsoever. And this is actually associated with why NADH and FADH2 do not provide the same amount of energy for the cell, right? Because NADH, right, it has the really low reduction potential. That difference is very high and goes to complex 1. And those electrons go from 1, 3 to 4, whereas FADH2 never passed through 1. It only ever entered on 2, then 3 and 4. Therefore, the electrons from NADH had 3 proteins to pump protons through, whereas FADH2 only had 2. Because of this difference in the amount of protons that were pumped for each, this is why we say that NADH actually produces more energy, or we get more ATP from it ultimately, and we'll talk where the ATP enters the chat in a little bit, compared to FADH2. It really has to do with like foundationally their reduction potentials, but that also decides where they actually enter the electron transport chain. But again, reiterating what you were mentioning before, Molly, it does not, and I repeat, does not go 1 to 2 to 3 to 4. It goes essentially 1, 3, 4, or 2, 3, 4. That's like, those are the pathways. That's it.
Yes. And I always, it's so important to mention and to dive deep into, make sure that we're all comfortable with it. There's something else that's kind of cool about complex 2, though. We talked about it last episode with TCA. What is it?
It's the
What
fact
is
that
the name of complex 2?
Like, well, it's a redox reaction, so it's a dehydrogenase. And when I think about like, oh, can I keep selling seashells for? Oh, wait a minute, isn't it succinate dehydrogenase? Isn't it the exact same enzyme that we talked about last episode?
Yes.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And a great thing that we mentioned before last episode was that the succinate dehydrogenase in TCA cycle, while it being the same as complex 2 of the electron transport chain, they also have another thing in common. That's how I remember where the FADH2 was produced in the TCA cycle. Because if I know that FADH2 is what goes to complex 2, oh, that's also where it's produced in TCA. The FADH2, which we know is produced in the TCA cycle, which we talked about last episode, is produced during the succinate dehydrogenase step, going from succinate to fumarate, right? It's produced at that step, but then also consumed during that complex 2 of TCA cycle. That's where we take it. We essentially create FADH2 and then we remove those electrons right away. This idea to me, I remember when I first learned this, was so foreign. I was like, I'd never learned this before. Why had I never learned this? FADH2 has in this really cool scenario where it doesn't actually leave the molecule. It's not just floating around in the cell, right? It's produced during that succinate dehydrogenase step in the TCA cycle, and it's like within succinate dehydrogenase. It doesn't just float around. It gains those electrons and then loses them right away to complex 2, which I think is such a cool idea.
Yeah, I agree. And I actually think it pretty well summarizes what happens in all the complexes, because people think of them as just one big protein glob that just accepts a or an electron, pumps a proton, and gives it off. But really, we have a lot of different molecules within those proteins that are willing to accept and then turn around and hand or give away that electron. It's basically, it's like not an assembly line. What is it? Where you accept and then you turn around and you give it to the next person. You've got a bunch of people in a row handing things off.
I would think that's an assembly line. Maybe.
Okay, let's call it an assembly line.
Sure.
Right, but you're basically taking it and giving it off and taking it and giving it off and taking it and giving off. I always called it hot potato. Mike made fun of me for it. It's a big game of hot potato, okay? It is. Those potatoes are electrons.
And those potatoes are electrons.
They are, right? You're just throwing them from person to person to person, right? In doing so, you're going to end up with oxygen, which is the biggest potato lover in the world, right? That's going to eat those electrons, like Mike was saying earlier.
Eating
to make water, right? So it's basically, again, it's a constant handoff, not just between complexes, but even between the different molecules that make up the complexes. So in that vein, with succinate dehydrogenase, which is complex 2, think of FAD as the first thing to reach out and grab that electron, and then it turns around and hands it off, right? It's just a part of complex 2. That's part of that line of people or a line of molecules that is part of this electron transition. And again, basically, rather than just take NADH and FADH2, strip the electrons off and give them right to oxygen, there's a huge difference in reduction potentials between those two molecules. Where would all of that energy go? Like, we don't want that. It's like falling off a cliff instead of sliding down a slide. Right? Falling off a cliff, you're changing altitude too fast, right? That's too much. It would be disastrous, right? Sliding down a big tall slide though, you slow your momentum, right? You're losing gravitational potential energy much slower, right? Like it's safer to do so. And of course, you can harness that energy that's released rather than creating like essentially an explosion of energy suddenly released all at once. We are slowly stripping that energy out. And again, we are storing it in the proton gradient. That's what the actual end result of the ETC is, other than the formation of water when oxygen accepts protons and electrons to form water. So I feel like we've pretty well established ETC. And now we've got this outcome. We've got a bunch of protons in the membrane.
Right.
Most students, like you said, say ETC's job is to make ATP. And it's not true. It's a misconception, but it is relevant to ETC, right? It's
Extremely.
not direct.
Yeah.
But why is ETC a part of aerobic respiration? Why do we talk about this as, important with ATP synthesis? What's the connection?
Right. And it's the idea that the protein that creates ATP is known as ATP synthase, which is also located on the inner mitochondrial membrane. But its role is to form ATP. ADP plus phosphate form ATP, but something that we generally recognize in terms of aerobic respiration is that's not a favorable process. That does not want to happen. Imagine I have ADP, 2 negatively charged phosphates, and you want to put another negative phosphate on ADP. That does not want to happen. This is not a favorable thing. But like they're repelling. Negative charges repel. So like we were saying before, non-favorable things don't happen unless we couple them to things that are very favorable, extremely favorable. And that's what the thing that we're coupling to this non-favorable thing, if causing protons to go up a gradient was very unfavorable, protons going down their gradient, extremely favorable. I always kind of think of it as like a waterfall. You know how we have like water. I'm actually pretty close. I live fairly close to Niagara Falls, so I was kind of think of Niagara Falls like relatively. I was actually there like 2 weekends ago. Yeah,
I
I
did
know
not know
it was a
that.
vibe. It was a vibe. Water goes down. Again, actually in the real world, this happens. We harness energy from waterfalls because the water goes down the waterfall, actually spins turbines, and we create electricity from that. It's such an interesting idea because if you actually zoomed in to the like ATP synthase, it actually looks exactly like that. It's legitimately a biological turbine, which I think is the coolest idea, where we have created this essentially this waterfall of protons, but right now this proton's sort of trapped in the intermembrane space. But as soon as we give it kind of a hole to get back into the matrix, like a pathway to give it back to the matrix, it will very quickly go down that gradient, follow its gradient, and that's a very favorable process. And the pathway that we provided to do that is the protein known as ATP synthase. And by those protons, by that gradient generated by the electron transport chain, again, they would not be there if not for electron transport chain. Just because we now have this huge gradient, they rush down, spin this turbine, essentially, of this biological turbine. Don't believe me? Look it up. Look up a picture of ATP synthase.
So
It's the
cool.
coolest thing. Spinning this turbine and actually produces ATP by literally forcibly combining ADP and phosphate to form ATP. This unfavorable process being coupled to this very favorable process of protons going down their gradient. And this is why a lot of times the electron transport chain is so closely associated with ATP, because again, ATP synthesis relies on the electron transport chain generating the gradient, but the electron transport chain is only the transport of electrons. ATP synthase never received an electron. It is not part of the electron transport chain, but very much relies on the product of the electron transport chain, which is this proton gradient.
Yes.
And so as a result, all that stored energy, that chemiosmotic gradient that we have here, is now finally converted to ATP. Right? That's
Mhm.
kind of like why the electron transport chain is so associated, even though it specifically does not produce the actual ATP itself.
Yes. And I feel like this is so critical to discuss because when we talk about the relationships between ETC, electron transport chain, and ATP synthesis, they're coupled, right? They're two separate processes, but they are linked by the proton gradient, right? Which means, right, the ETC is creating a precursor for ATP synthesis. If I blocked, let's say I added a drug to a cell, and let's say that that drug's mechanism was to shut off complex 3.
Okay.
Right? What would happen? What would happen?
Oh my
Let's
goodness.
say to water production. Would we still get water? Let's start there.
So, like, if I'm shutting down complex 3, that means the electron, if I had those electrons from NADH and FADH2, okay, complex 1 and complex 2 would still happen, but then they can't transfer their electrons to complex 3. So we'd essentially be cutting off the chain. So therefore, no more electrons can go past that point in the chain. So if I'm asking, can we get to complex 4, which will actually give those electrons to oxygen to become water? Absolutely not. Water production would be essentially extremely lowered, if not inhibited. Of course, there's a little bit of water produced in glycolysis, but in terms of the electron transport chain, no water would be produced whatsoever because we cannot get through the chain. So in that case, no. And then I would also be thinking, what would happen to the amount of ATP produced, Molly?
Yeah. So if we can't, and this I think is a really key idea, if you picture the complexes as accepting electrons from one, turning around, handing it to the next, and it's this constant flux. If one person just holds on to their electron and is just holding it,
The potato.
and I'm not handing it off. Yeah, I'm holding my potato. I'm not eating the potato. I'm just holding on to it. Right. If I'm just standing here holding it, the person behind me or the complex behind me now has an electron that it can't pass me because I'm already just holding it since I don't have anyone to pass it to. Right? Which means my whole line or chain of complexes don't have anywhere to put their electron. They can't hand them off because we can't have the electrons leave the chain to go bind to oxygen to form water. So if ETC complex 3 is inhibited, you're not going to be getting you're not going to be getting electron transfer in any of the other complexes because you've stopped it. There's no ability for that to continue flowing. And so even in earlier complexes, 1 and 2, you really wouldn't get a lot of proton pumping. You wouldn't really get protons pumped in general because you've now essentially put a dam in the river. It's not flowing anymore. It's going to start building up. So we're getting, right, very, very few protons being pumped into that intermembrane space, which, keep in mind, that is the fuel for ATP synthase. That's the water in your waterfall. If you don't have that, you can't spin the turbines and you will not get any ATP production.
Absolutely.
So if you inhibit complex 3, you've turned off ETC, you're not producing water, right? You're not refilling your proton gradient, which means you're not getting ATP.
Right.
That's really, really important.
Right.
What I think is really cool, though, to talk about is what would happen. Let's say ETC is working fine. Let's say ATP synthase is broken.
Oh.
And let's say for now, there's nothing else different in there. So we have ETC that's working fine. ATP synthase is broken. There's no other way for protons to pass through the membrane. What would happen?
Oh, this is interesting. This is a really interesting one. I would say
a question about this.
I would kind of think like what are my options, but here's what my kind of anticipation would be. By the way, for preface, we did not prepare these questions. I'm just kind of thinking off the dome. So I would think that, okay, if the electron transport chain itself isn't inhibited, it would probably still keep on going for a little bit. But eventually, that chemiosmotic gradient is simply just going to keep on building up because there's no way for it to like kind of go down a waterfall. Imagine I just keep on pushing things up and now they just keep on going. So eventually the gradient is going to be so strong that my pumps are going to try to push more protons up, but eventually it'll require so much energy that my redox reactions can't provide to keep on pumping protons. So even then, even if I stop my ATP synthase and my electron transport chain is going to work fine, it will keep on working for a little bit, but then eventually it will also stop as a result.
Yeah, there's going to be so many protons in that intermembrane space that it's just going to become too overwhelmingly unfavorable to pump any more protons. It's just going to be full. The pH of the intermembrane space is going to be super low because, again, more protons means lower pH. If you have that many, ETC is going to stop too. These are all consistent with what we've talked about. Mess with ETC, you get no ATP synthesis. If you mess with ATP synthase, you get minimum ETC. But, and this is the coolest part, there do exist drugs and toxins and molecules that can actually allow the electron transport chain to function completely normally. Completely normally, and yet you get no ATP synthesis. And the way they do this is by opening a pore in the membrane, in that inner membrane, that allows protons to leave without going through the turbine. As we've talked about, the ETC is totally independent of ATP synthase, except in that it creates that proton gradient. If there's nothing to relieve that gradient and therefore allow the flow, right, we're going to stop working. Right. If my ETC is fine, and I also have this pore, basically a doorway where electrons can just flow right through, or protons can flow right through, ETC is going to be like, cool, I'm going to just keep making the proton gradient because clearly the protons are being used for something. That's all it sees. ETC cannot sense how much ATP is being produced. It doesn't care. It's a different world. The only way it senses it is through that proton gradient. So if we add a molecule called an uncoupler, which I've seen this in many passages, which is why I think it's so fun. If I add an uncoupler, which provides a doorway for protons to pass through that inner membrane space, or from the inner membrane space into the matrix without ATP synthesis, they're going to take that door rather than going through the turbine. I always, and you make fun of me for always having stories, but I always think I live right next to Disneyland, right? If you are trying to get into Disneyland or trying to get out of Disneyland or some amusement park, you know how they slow you down, this huge mass of people, and you have to go single file through the little turnstile, show your ticket, and it's really slow. You're willing to do that because you really want to get to the other side of that gate, right? Like you're willing to do that. You're so excited to go to Disneyland or whatever. You will go single file. you will spin the turnstile, right? You're willing to, because that's the only way to get in. If we took the gates to that amusement park and blew them wide open, are you really going to take 30 minutes to go in a single file line and push a little turnstile to enter the park? Or are you going to walk through the wide open gates?
Right.
Like, why would you ever choose to do the turnstile option? The turnstile option is ATP synthase. You have to push your way through, and it's pretty slow, right? If there's a huge gate, why not just go through there, right? So an uncoupler will allow ETC to work fine. Water will be produced, proton gradient will be made, and then it will leave through the uncoupler, but you will get no ATP made. So it is possible to have one without the other. You can't have ATP synthase activity without ETC because you need that proton gradient. ETC is broken, ATP synthase isn't working, but it is possible to
have ETC without ATP synthase, right? And
this is so cool.
This is really cool. And actually, I take like a gym bro side of this. There's actually an anabolic drug that is actually an uncoupler, extremely unsafe,
dangerous,
extremely unsafe.
It was a dieting drug.
Yeah, and I actually love talking about why it's so dangerous, right? Because
I know.
so the idea, of course, that's what we love to talk about, dangerous things. So it did exactly what you're talking about, right? Where it would insert itself on the inner mitochondrial membrane and cause a different pathway for these protons. But you would imagine, right? You are now uncoupling ETC from the ATP for ATP synthase. The amount of ATP we're producing then, right, is going to be disrupted. If I don't change anything, the amount of ATP produced is actually going to go down. So what actually happens, which is really interesting, what they found as a side effect is your heat goes up. The people had this really crazy side effect of like overheating. And the reason people were like essentially overheating on this drug was because everything had to work so much harder to try to stay up to date with all like the ATP demands of the body. So imagine like you have the electron transport chain working. Now our body's like, oh, we're not producing enough ATP. So now we're like, oh, still need to meet the demands of the body. So what's going to happen is now our metabolism is going to work so much harder and consume so much more to meet the same ATP demands. And so this is why people actually started overheating so much, because you've essentially caused a way where our whole metabolic pathway would work and we wouldn't produce anything. So we were like, oh, now we have to work double the amount to produce the same effect. And then that would cause that overheating.
Plus, keep in mind with that waterfall, right? We've stored a bunch of energy in that gradient from all the redox reactions. That energy we slow it down and we use it and we create ATP, which is storing the energy, right? Imagine you had, let's say, a dam break loose, rather than harnessing power, taking little streams off that dam to, water plants or whatever. Imagine the dam just bursts, right? If you have no ability to control and harness it, it's incredibly dangerous. And when we have a bunch of energy, very high energy gradient being released passively, right? That energy has to go somewhere. It's being released out into the environment, and it's released as heat. So every time ETC pumps a proton and then the proton gets to leave, we're basically storing energy in the gradient and then letting that energy be released as heat to the environment of the cell. So every time we have aerobic metabolism, we're creating heat. And like you said, we have to kick it up into overdrive because we're not making any ATP. Incredibly dangerous. This used to be a weight loss drug. I think in like how long ago was this?
This was like, it was like circling around for a while. What was it called again?
It's DNP. I had to look it up because I always forget it. 2,4-dinitrophenol.
Yes. Yes.
Yeah. I'm going to look up when it was banned, but it was very common. DNP. And it was incredibly dangerous. Plus you're basically starving yourself. But yeah, there's a couple others that will impact this, this ETC ATP synthase relationship. And it was banned in 1938, by the way.
Oh, wow. 1938.
That's a long time ago.
I did not realize people were that into anabolics and things like that. Like that long ago.
It's a weight loss drug too.
I mean, I suppose, but like I didn't think that was a huge thing back in the day. I thought this was more of a thing in like the 70s and 80s. But hey, I mean, you learn something new every day in terms of history. But yeah, this is the cool thing where the things that we're learning for the MCAT are very, very applicable, kind of like to the real world. And I mean, I've got to talk about it because we haven't chatted about it yet. Cyanide is
Cyanide, I know.
also a really cool thing that I'm sure we've heard about. We've all seen like the spy movies where they're like, oh, they had like a cyanide thing in their
capsule.
tooth, and then they
Yeah,
like
yeah.
chew on it, and like, oh no, there's a cyanide pill. Oh, we all know we've heard of this as like a poison, but it's very, very cool because the target of cyanide is actually complex 4 of the electron transport chain, right? Like, oh yeah, like this magic poison. No, it targets the complex 4. So we can kind of imagine or anticipate why cyanide is so poisonous. Well, imagine if it inhibits complex 4, it's the exact thing what we're talking about. I'm going to use your analogy here because I think it's hilarious. Where he took the potato is in our hands, and we are not, we have
We're not
held up the
passing it
whole
off.
line.
We're burning our hands.
Where our
It's a
hands
hot
are burning
potato.
here. No electrons are being flowing through. Therefore, the line will stop. No more protons getting pumped. And the problem with cyanide is that we can't use oxygen anymore, and we are not producing any more energy. So therefore, people die when they take cyanide. So very cool application once again, but see, this is where it makes sense. And I think kind of bringing it back to as well, like the MCAT, this is how what we're talking about right now is exactly how the MCAT tests the electron transport chain and oxidative phosphorylation. A lot of this, sometimes they're going to ask the very simple, like, okay, where's the first electron, like protein in the electron or complex in the electron transport chain. But most of the time when they actually test it, it's always something goes wrong or what if this happens? Like the questions that we just asked each other is exactly how they ask. Like, oh, hey, this complex isn't working. What happens? Or we add this inhibitor. Now this doesn't work. What is the most likely outcome? I see students struggle so much with this because they're like, how am I supposed to know? I've just memorized the
didn't
three
memorize this.
right?
Yeah.
I can just memorize the 3 complexes or 4 complexes. You can't memorize your way through electron transport chain crescents. This is actually why people struggle with it because we just try to memorize it. No, we need to understand why the electron transport chain is the significance. What are the foundational concepts that lead to the reasons that it works, and why is it important? Right? If you understand these things, how it all relates to one another, then if something's disrupted, oh well, then it just makes sense what would happen. Like the question you asked me, Molly, like I was like, I don't know the exact answer, but here's what I think would happen. Like the whole like blocking thing, and that's exactly what they'll expect you to do. Exactly what they'll expect you to do on the MCAT.
Yeah. And this, I mean, with ATP synthase, we've made it our full way through aerobic respiration, right? Keep in mind, aerobic respiration as a whole, we took glucose. Of course, there are other molecules that can feed into this pathway, which we're actually going to talk about pretty soon. But we took glucose, right? And we are oxidizing glucose into carbon dioxide. That was completely done by the end of the TCA cycle. Okay, that half of the redox pathway, glucose being oxidized into carbon dioxide, that was done. All right, before this episode even started. We also have oxygen being reduced into water. That happens in complex 4 of the ETC. All throughout all of these different processes of aerobic metabolism, we've made sometimes ATP directly, but often we're storing those high energy electrons in NADH and FADH2. ETC is really where we get the most bang for our buck. Right? We've stored a lot of energy in this NADH and FADH2, and this is where we really get it all paid out. So this is where the bulk of that ATP production happens. And if you ever needed to calculate specifics, right, just so you know, 1 molecule of ATP, right, or 1 mole of it, you could say whatever you want, 1 mole of NADH will create 2.5 ATP. 1 mole of FADH2 will lead to 1.5 moles of ATP. Okay, so again, we talked about how NADH ultimately stores more energy because NADH has a much lower reduction potential. It's got electrons, but it really didn't want them compared to FADH2. Therefore, when those electrons are taken from NADH and given to oxygen, there's a lot more energy released. And as you mentioned, FADH2 dropping off to complex 2, it doesn't even span the membrane. There's no option. So 2.5 ATP per NADH, 1.5 ATP per FADH2. Ultimately, this leads to a lot of ATP production. Typically, throughout the whole process, we talk somewhere between 30 and 36 ATP, which is a lot. Depends on the efficiency of the cell and all that good stuff. But
and I always like comparing this to like, and because this is aerobic respiration.
To anaerobic, yes.
Right. Because aerobic respiration, 30 to 36, like again, depending on the efficiency. Comparing to anaerobic, right, per glucose, you're only producing 2 ATP. right? And that's because of glycolysis, because that can function anaerobically, but nothing else can. So like when we think about efficiency, like you'll get a lot of questions on the MCAT about like this efficiency of like, oh, in an anaerobic versus aerobic. Yeah, anaerobic per glucose produces way less ATP because it doesn't have access, it can't do all these other processes, especially electron transport chain, that produces so much ATP.
Yes.
Yeah.
So the pathway that we've talked about really is the common pathway through which we create ATP, which keep in mind is needed for pretty much everything.
Everything, yeah.
Right? It is like the cash money of the cell. It's used in pretty much every process, not every process, but most, right? Anything that requires a non-spontaneous reaction to occur, typically we use ATP synthesis or ATP hydrolysis to provide that energy. So this is really critical. And as we've talked about, the body does not really like to create a ton of parallel pathways and create enzymes to break down molecules differently. We talked about it with glycolysis, right?
Yeah,
We
with
had
the
DHAP and
G3P.
G3P, right? I have two products that are not identical. Do I want to create a totally different cascade with lots of different enzymes to do each one? Or should I take a second and take DHAP and make it into G3P, and now I just need one path? That's really what the body does with all of our other sources of energy, right? Proteins and fats. We're not really going to use DNA and RNA for energy. If you ever did, you would be
We've got bigger problems.
before that. Like that is your
got bigger
last
problems.
resort. You would never harness that
Yeah.
for energy.
Yeah.
Right. But protein and fats definitely can be used for energy. So one thing that we need to touch on still is how, right? We have these different processes through which we can take a protein and fit it in to some intermediate of aerobic metabolism. Same thing with fats, right? We could take a fatty acid or a triglyceride, take that glycerol, put it through glycolysis, or we could take those fatty acids, run them through beta oxidation, produce acetyl-CoA. And again, there's a million different entry points to this pathway. But the reason why we covered this in so much detail is because this is how we make ATP. That being said, there are a lot of other reactions in metabolism that we haven't talked about directly. And that is what we're going to do next episode.
Next episode. Yeah, we're going to be talking about all of those fun pathways. Again, a lot of them really branch off of, this central aerobic. Again, this is why we kind of cover the central pathway that really branch off this pathway. Yeah, things like aerobic, what am I saying? PPP, like the pentose phosphate pathway, glycogenesis, glycogenolysis, beta oxidation, fatty acid synthesis, ketogenesis, ketone bodies, how they're related. All of these pathways really, again, are very related to the central pathway, but branch off. And we do these things based on the conditions in the body and in the cell. Because we know, like, we don't always want to be doing aerobic respiration all the time. There is going to be, depending on the conditions in the body and in the cell, and the signals that are happening, different things that we want to be doing. And we're going to be talking about those all next episode. So next episode, we're going to be talking about metabolic connections. We're going to be kind of like really painting like an overall picture about where this all fits in, and really talking to like really all those other pathways, which I think is so much fun.
Yeah, I'm so excited. I love talking about metabolism, and most of what you're going to see is aerobic respiration, but all of these other pathways fit in. They all connect. This is like the central pathway. And there are so many things that either feed into this pathway or use intermediates of these pathways to do other things. So I'm super excited for next episode. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode, and I hope you guys are just as excited for the next one. If you haven't already, definitely make sure to check out our other metabolism episodes. And while you're doing that, might as well check out a couple others as well. The metabolic connections is going to involve a discussion of things like glycolysis and PDC and TCA, as well as the material today. So make sure you've got a basic background, right? Basic comfort level, because next week we're going to tie it all together, which is going to be super fun.
So exciting.
I can't wait.
Right. No, and and we can't wait to see you all there. But in the meantime, wherever we're catching you all, hope you have a great day, evening, night, weekend, wherever we're catching you. And until then, happy studying, everyone. We'll catch you later.
Bye.
Bye now.
Welcome to the Jack Westin MCAT podcast with your hosts, Michael Maleka
and Molly Hudash.